Welcome back, travelers, to the Planeswalker's Tome, your portal to the realms of Magic the Gathering. Whether you're joining us on YouTube or through our podcast, we're thrilled to have you along for the journey. Before we delve into today's chapter, a quick legal note. While we're diving into the rich world crafted by Wizards of the Coast, it's important to remember that this is an unofficial audiobook produced with love and respect for the original content. Rest assured, our endeavor is fully compliant with the 2017 Wizards of the Coast fan content policy. Now, let us resume our exploration of The Eternal Ice by Grubb. Chapter 10. The Royal Palace. All leaders suffer at the hands of their times. A warrior king bridles in their peace, and a scholarly lord chafes and exhausts himself while at war. The rulers we truly remember are those fortunate enough to live in times that are matched to their temperaments, or those who manipulate their times to match their moods. Argoth, Argivian scholar. This time, they went in through the front door. Jodah announced himself at the city's main gate as Archmage Eternal Jodah of the School of the Unseen on Latnam. He requested an audience with His Majesty King Darian. Yaya and Jodah were shown to a neatly furnished room just off the main gate and were served tea and freshly baked biscuits as a runner was dispatched to the castle proper. Yaya watched the messenger, a long, lanky boy, lope indifferently up to the gentle slope to the royal castle. He came down much faster, and an honor guard was quickly formed to escort the two visitors to the castle in proper style. Half a unit of Kajadorian guards went before Yaya and Jodah, half the unit after them, and Yaya felt like they were the filling mashed between two heavy slabs of bread. Bread wearing heavily studded armor and cheek-guarded helmets. The leader of the entire procession was one of the winged-helmed elite guards, possibly a friend of the one who Yaya had pirated the medallion from. She wondered idly if he ever got it back. "It seems that you rate," she said to Jodah, as they marched up the cobblestone streets. As they passed, merchants sweep the frozen chill stores from the front of their store shops, stopped to regard them with hard eyes. "You misunderstand," said Jodah. "This is no honor. They want to show me that they're capable, competent, and powerful. Just in case I get any ideas about making trouble here." Yaya made a rude noise. "Yeah, like you couldn't just vault the wall with a spell and summon a thundercloud beast over their heads." "I didn't say they were sane and think they could intimidate me," said Jodah, his face a mask of disappointment. "I just said that that's how they thought. Now remember, let me do the talking." The front doors of the palace were massive blocks of what Yaya thought at first were white stone battered in cast iron. Upon closer inspection, the stone was in fact ivory, and the task mage wondered what gigantic whale or walrus perished produced such large blocks. The main halls were equally resplendent, decked with well-cared-for tapestries and curtains made of woven gold. Yaya was more used to the servants' entrances and skulking through the back halls of such places after the lights had been turned out, but decided that this was a much better experience. Even the hallways were warm, lit by huge braziers filled with glowing coals. The gate guard had vaporized at the iron-shod gates, replaced by a royal guard of women, dressed in brass plates and golden chainmail. They wore ornately ruined black blades on their backs, and Jodah smiled when he saw these. It was a wistful smile, and one that Yaya had not seen in their recent weeks together. It was the smile of memory. There were more halls, more uplands, and finally a great set of doors, 20 feet in height, operated by a pair of collared giants. This was the throne room of King Darian himself. His Majesty's domain was a huge hall, 3 stories high, lit from a string of arched windows across the topmost story. The second story held a balcony, and there Yaya could see a swirling mass of color. The courtiers stooped off the main floors, had gathered there, and were mixing, plotting, and gossiping on their own. Yaya felt the pressure of a multitude of eyes as they crossed the great chamber. Hanging from the balconies were the banners of the various military orders, the sacred torch, the flaming blade, the white shield, and others. The banners were bedecked by snowstorms of color, and Yaya realized that they were trophies from previous campaigns. Many of the banners were almost unrecognizable, and had become so legendary that their very insignia were buried within the world of honors. At the far end was a simple dais, a few low steps, topped by an expansive throne. It had been custom-made, Yaya remembered, for one of the great military leaders of the Kajeld, a huge warrior who was said to be part giant. The present king rattled about in the huge seat like a pea in the bottom of a wine bottle. His Majesty was young and red-blonde, lean but not thin, his eyes bright, and his raiment as opulent as the rooms. To one side was a taller, more impressive man, in armor, backed up by a female aide, dressed in much the same manner as the elite guard, though with a flashier helmet. To the other side was Gustatha Epplesdaughter, the royal mage, dressed in a waterfall of blue robes. All except the king were scowling. Yaya liked to imagine that the mage and the two warriors had been suddenly summoned from other, more important duties to be here. There were other guards all around, but the four figures on the dais dominated their end of the room. The royal mage broke free of her quartet and glided across a polished floor towards them. Yaya was sure the royal mage had feet. She had seen them, but the robes were so thick and full that Gustatha seemed to flow down the steps of the dais like a cascade. She intercepted Jodah and Yaya about 5 yards from the throne. Gustatha dropped to one knee, her luscious dark hair spilling forward as she did. "Welcome to Grubb, Archmage Eternal," she said. "I bid you personal welcome to our humble kingdom." Jodah gave a pleasant but perfunctory nod in response. "It is very good to be here," he said as the royal mage picked herself up off the floor. "It's been many, many years since I was here last. I hope there will be time in your schedule to talk about spells one evening. Our humble school could greatly benefit from your knowledge." Her smile flashed winningly. "Your school is renowned for its prowess," said Jodah, smiling blankly. "It is, but a shadow compared to yours," said Gustatha, smiling back. Jodah took a step forward, but Gustatha held up a hand, her smile fading quickly as the door shut. "Before we go any further, I must discuss something with you. A recent unpleasantness," she said. "Uh-oh," thought Yaya. Gustatha looked in Jodah's eyes, bright and innocent. "A few days ago, my personal quarters were burglarized, and an item of great power was taken. You don't know anything about this, do you?" Yaya held her face still, her own eyes wide and innocent. She would let Jodah do the talking. Jodah nodded sagely and said, "I'm afraid I do. That item of power was mine, and I had my assistant here retrieve it on my behalf. My apologies for not coming for it myself." Both Yaya and Gustatha startled at Jodah's admission. Yaya opened her mouth to complain, but Gustatha recovered first. "Ah, well, regardless of the true ownership, the fact remains that my sanctum had been invaded." She nodded politely at Yaya, but her eyes were aglow with anger. "By your assistant. Until you and I discuss the matter fully, I have to treat your assistant as a common thief." "I see," said Jodah, nodding for a moment, raising a hand slightly, signaling Yaya to start for her own complaint. Yaya shifted in place but remained silent. "It's just that I can't present a known felon to His Majesty," Gustatha said, introducing an embarrassing chuckle at the words known felon. Yaya reddened, but the royal mage continued. "We are a nation of laws, after all." "Ah," said Jodah, and he turned to Yaya. The tasked mage expected Jodah to declare how useful or capable she was, and assure the royal mage that Yaya did not steal any of the royal silverware at the royal dinner. Instead, he said, "Yaya, I believe Gustatha here wants you to arrest for your crimes. Be a good girl and go with the nice guards, will you?" Yaya opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The sound cut in again, once the gold-armored guards had their hands on her shoulders, and manacles had been produced. "Jodah, don't think for a moment that I'm—" "Get your hands off me," she snarled, trying to shake off the gauntleted hands. Yaya reached into the base of her brain, and picked a simple spell to shake off her attackers, and was rewarded with a massive headache, a harsh pain that seemed to consume the left half of her brain. She staggered slightly and raised an angry glare at the royal mage. For her part, Gustatha calmly lowered her hands and gave a calm smile. The manacles were fastened around her wrists, and a wave of golden chainmail bore her back towards the huge entrance gates. She found her voice just as she was leaving. "Jodah, what the hell do you think you're doing? Jodah, I helped you. Jodah, you son of a—" The rest of her curse was lost as the enslaved giants closed the gates behind her. Jodah turned back towards Gustatha. "I apologize for the disruption," he said calmly. "It is nothing," said Gustatha, "and I want you to know it's nothing personal." "It never is," replied Jodah. "Now, shall we meet your king?" In her cell, Yaya split her time between cursing and pacing, often doing both at once. As cells went, it wasn't the worst that Yaya had spent time in. The walls were covered, and a thick mattress with a heavy comforter dominated the bed. A few huge volumes of Keshaldoran history, complete with woodcut illustrations, were stacked on the reading table, next to an overstuffed chair. A bronze bowl with dried fruit rested on another low table. Still, it was a cell. Bars on the doors and a single high window. Runic spells carved into both. Beyond the barred door, the occasional shadow of a guard watched by. It was most definitely a cell. And then there was the subject of the manacles. Heavy, ancient things. The manacles looked like brittle relics. Some unknown symbol of 2 interlinking suns was stamped into their wide parts, which meant nothing to Yaya. What was important was a filigree of water silver, which kept her spells at bay. So she paced and she cursed. Then she did both at once. Jodah's name, not surprisingly, came up fairly often. After a long time of pacing and cursing, the lock on the cell door clicked. Yaya walked to the center of the room and stood there, arms crossed in front of her. Probably dinner, she thought. It was always a good idea not to jump the guard at the first opportunity, but rather get to know his habits. All the better to jump him later. She was already considering the heavy volume of Kjeldorian history as potential weapons. Jodah popped his head into the room. "Are you getting settled in?" he said brightly. Yaya let off a string of curses and charged towards the archmage. Jodah held a finger to his lips, which brought down her volume only half a notch. He closed the door behind him. "The guard is napping. A small spell. But your sharding would wake the dead." "Do you blame me?" snarled Yaya, holding up her manacled wrist for effect. "I saved you. I put my backside on the line for you. And then you turned me in? Let me do the talking, you said. You worm. You said you needed me here." "I do need you," said Jodah calmly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Which is why you're in this cell now." Grubb and Gastata was a slap in her royally magical face. Popping you in the proverbial jug was a suitable slap back at me. Now she feels better about the entire incident. All seems forgiving, and I think she'll be more willing to help. "So happy for her," spat Yaya, collapsing in the overstuffed chair. "We'll need all the hours we can get," said Jodah. "Having showed me who's boss around here, she can afford to be more reasonable." "Oh yeah, I feel real reasonable now," said Yaya, calming down only slightly. "And besides, if people think you're here, then you can move around more easily," said Jodah calmly. "And besides, if people think you're here, then you can move around more easily," said Jodah calmly. Yaya's face pulled in on itself. When she spoke, there was venom in her voice. "I really hate it when you're like this." "Like what?" asked Jodah blinkingly. "So smug and superior," snapped Yaya. "So confident and powerful. Lord High Archmage, bloody everlasting. Able to glide through the worst situations like a brownie on ice skates. An answer for every question, a plan for every situation. I liked you better before you remembered who you were. When you were confused. When you thought you weren't real. I liked you better when you were nice." Jodah's jaw dropped open, as if he'd been punched. "I'm not nice now?" "You had me thrown in prison," shouted Yaya. "But for a reason," Jodah stepped back, raising from his seat. "You can move around better behind the scenes now. I told you that." "You tell me now," said Yaya, "after I've been tossed in the jug. Did you ever think to let me in on this beforehand?" Jodah opened his mouth, raising both hands to make his point. Then he let out a sigh and seemed to deflate as Yaya watched him. Finally, he sat back down on the bed, his head down. "You're right. I didn't think to warn you this might happen. I'm used to leading and expecting others to follow." Yaya looked hard at Jodah. "And why do you think I'm with you? That I wanted to follow you? That I hope to learn a few spells from you? That I want to someday be the high grand archmage of some ice-water town? Why do you think I came after you in the first place, when more powerful wizards had written you off?" Jodah blinked. "I suppose I hadn't thought about it." Yaya held up her manacles. "Well, you might want to think about it before you let me loose." There was a long moment of silence in the room. Jodah leaned forward, put his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor. Then he said, "I suppose you're right." "About which part?" snapped Yaya. "About most of it," said Jodah, sighing. "I am ancient, and I've been through most things before, and that's why I've always seemed to have a plan, and why I don't seem to be so angry at Gathasa and Grubb, and why I don't seem to appreciate what you've done." Yaya started to say something, but Jodah held up a hand. "No, I need to say this. Now that I have my memories back and my sanity under lock and key, it's hard for me to think of other people. Important people. And by that, I don't mean people like Gerda, or Gastata, or Limdul, or even Flaes. I mean people who are important to me. Like you. You've always been important to me," said Yaya, "since the day I broke into your study. And," Jodah took a deep breath, "after all these years, I'm just as bad as anyone else on this plane about talking about how I feel. And if that makes me look cold or inhumane or unfeeling," he looked up at Yaya, and the corners of his eyes were moist, "I'm sorry." Yaya looked at the archmage and leaned forward in her chair. "I think I believe you." "Only because I mean it," said Jodah, pausing to choose his words carefully. "I trust you, even though I don't always agree with you. And I need you as a friend, and as a helper, and as a guide, even after all these years." Yaya was silent for a moment and said, "Better, old man, much better. I really hope that means you plan to get me out of here, like real soon." Jodah rose from the bed. his face brightening with a sly smile. Of course. Was there ever any doubt? All right. There was. Here, let me take a look at those bindings. The archmage crossed the room and looked at the manacles. A small, thin smile spread across his face. I really hate that smile too, grumbled Yaya, as Jodah examined the bonds. What smiles? Said Jodah, not looking up. The smile you always get, said Yaya. I got it early at the gate when I made that fuss about us. That superior, oh, I know what to do because I've done it 1,000 centuries smile. Well, when you've been around as long as I have, you find yourself repeating yourself sometimes. He raised his 2 fingers and a thin white blade appeared at his fingertip. Now, don't move. I don't want you to have to cast your spells with one hand. Yaya gritted her teeth as Jodah slid the mana blade along the unseen edges of her manacles. They popped off and clattered to the floor. Yaya kicked them under the chair and rubbed her wrists as Jodah crossed back to the bed. So what's the skinny, she said, as Jodah settled himself again. Not good, said Jodah, lines appearing on his forehead. The goal was to make peace with Gasthatha and rally the Kejdadoran throne against Limdul. The first is pretty much under control. But the latter, he shook his head. Nothing doing, said Yaya. Jodah sighed. You remember the large, heavily armored man at the king's side? I only saw him briefly, said Yaya, but I remembered him. Big lug, short grey beard. Jodah chuckled. Well, the big lug is Avram Garrison, de facto leader of the various fighting orders and the general of the armies of Kejdadoran all but name. Apparently he was the favorite of the late queen, who passed on last year, and left Darien with the throne and no other help. The woman behind Avram was introduced as Captain Varchild, his aide. I don't think the two get along, but I'm not sure why. In any event, Jodah continued, Garrison has the ear of the king at the moment, and he doesn't believe Limdul is a real threat. Come spring, Avram wants the kid to campaign against the barbarians, against Cold Eyes people. Yaya sneered. That makes sense. The Kejadorians, particularly those from Krov, often take war spoils. Ears, eyes, fingers. Fighting the undead doesn't usually provide those types of trophies. Jodah nodded sagely. More importantly, much of Limdul's troops are former Kejadorians themselves, raised from their snowy graves by his magic. It will be a tough war to fight against one's own countrymen. Limdul knows that. And there's a general belief among the soldiers that Dim Bull is a paper tiger, said Yaya, thinking of her own discussions with Belinda, that the wizards say he's a danger only to justify their existence to the king, when the true threat is the barbarians. And the wizards are as fractured as the various military orders, added Jodah. Elementalists, machinists, sorcerers, and the followers of that idiot Zur in the hinterlands. Gasthatha has her hands full keeping them together. I think she needs a common enemy to unify them. In addition, she's afraid of Limdul. I've done nothing to calm that fear. Her fears didn't stop her from being part of a plot to keep you on ice, noted Yaya. Wheels within wheels, favors upon favor, said Jodah. Note that I don't hold anything against her for that. Her part was minor. She seemed upset over the actions of others, and she was merely acting like a typical human being for her best intentions. Now that you remember what that's like, muttered Yaya. Anyway, she's at least willing to listen. She thinks that the necromancer has got too powerful, and I think she's right. We're about to meet for a state dinner. She thinks I'm napping after our long trip, and she's taking the opportunity to redouble her magical protections. I have a room in her tower. I am familiar with it, said Yaya dryly. It's on the 3rd floor from the top. Jodah nodded. They're going to keep as many eyes on me as possible. First, Gasthatha, and then, when I don't go on my merry way, Garrison as well. I can feel magical incantations being spun and ritual wardings going up even as we speak. I need to know how deep the feelings against the barbarians are, and how deep the realization is beyond the palace walls that Limdul is the true threat. For that, I don't need or want spells. You want me, said Yaya, the corner of her mouth pulling back in a smirk. Yaya Ballard, humble dealer in gossip and secrets. You do seem to know everybody worth knowing in Eastern Tezier, said Jodah, without a touch of sarcasm. So what's the plan, asked Yaya. We walk out of here, said Jodah. I meet with Gasthatha, you check out the grounds, see in particular if you can dig up anything on this Avram Garrison. The military abhors a vacuum, and I don't know why he isn't a general. Maybe Gasthatha has something to do with that. That would explain to why they're both fighting to control the king. There's already a feeling that the king is weak, said Yaya. A puppet for the merchants and mages. The king is young and untested, countered Jodah. There's a difference between that and being weak. That may be why he's responding so well to the idea of crusading against the barbarians. He needs to prove himself. If you can find out anything else on top of that, do it. Aha, said Yaya. In the meantime, what happens when they check my cell? Do I leave a little note saying, sorry, out collecting gossip? Oh, I'll take care of that, said Jodah. He closed his eyes and let his fingers dance through the air. Yaya leaned back, half expecting to be the target of the spell. Instead, the air thickened to the left of her, as if all the dust was being pushed to the center of the room. A bluish ball formed in the middle of the dust cloud, and spread outwards, stopping only to form a silhouette of Yaya's profile. As Yaya watched, the blue smoke thickened and gained color, until a duplicate of the attached mage stood beside her, its wrists still in the manacles. Yaya stood up and circled her magical duplicates. Her hips are too big, she said at last. It'll be sufficient to fool the guard, said Jodah, and much better than stuffing your bed with straw. Yaya looked at the figures. Are my hips that big? It'll do in a pinch, said Jodah, trying not to get drawn into the discussion. Now we should go. She looks nothing like me, said Yaya. Of course not. One more thing, said Jodah, and he snapped his fingers. The figure sprang to life immediately, and began pacing the room, cursing a blue streak. There, said Jodah. The resemblance is perfect. Shall we go? This concludes Chapter 10 of our saga. If you enjoyed the tale so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us both on YouTube and your preferred podcast platform. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, may your adventures be as boundless as the plains themselves. Thank you for listening.